Good morning. Today is Tuesday, January 9th, 2024. Since the consideration of MAID, medical assistance in dying, which is the current euphemism for euthanasia, since consideration of this for terminal illness first arose in Quebec a number of years ago, and then it became the law in all of Canada, it has always been supported by a clear majority of Canadians. I have been clear since the very beginning of this issue years ago that according to Jewish law, MAID is an act of murder. It is prohibited according to Jewish law. Though, of course, I can understand and have sympathy for those who choose it. Often they are suffering terribly, and I could imagine that if, God forbid, I was in their position, I would also want to be able to end that suffering, but it doesn't depend on what I want. It's wrong. It's a terrible, terrible violation of Jewish law and moral law. And as I pointed out many times, it opens a slippery slope that we have seen Canadian law tumbling down with increased rapidity. First of all, of course, there are the numerous, inevitable reports of the abuse of this law. Individuals who choose MAID or who are persuaded to choose MAID who are not within the categories that should be allowed, for whom it is clearly not appropriate according to the law. Plus, legally, a steady loosening of the guidelines for MAID with the predicted outcome of the sharply rising rate of people turning to MAID across Canada and in Quebec specifically. Now, an extreme example of how bad it has gotten is that in March 2021, the Canadian government passed a law, C7. And this law did two things. One is it removed the requirement that MAID would only be available for those suffering from terminal illness. Again, we generally assume a terminal illness is an illness from which there is no cure. The government's law, C7, removed that requirement and simply refers to an irremediable medical condition. An illness, a disease, but not necessarily terminal, which is a gigantic shift and enlargement of the pool for whom MAID would be available. Plus, and here's the point that I really want to dwell on today, plus C7, Bill C7, for the first time, added the option of euthanasia for a person that has a mental illness without any other physical illness accompanying it. Now, when the government did that, March 2021, it immediately put a 2-year moratorium on allowing MAID for mental illness in order to give the community, the professionals, time to plan for this new stage, this very wide expansion, and to develop protocols and standards, etc. In 2023, just last year, the government extended that moratorium for another year. We've talked about this before. What that means is that according to the current plan, unless the government pauses this again or gets rid of it, euthanasia for mental illness alone will become an option on March 17th, 2024, just over 2 months from today. Now, the first thing that I want to point out is that for the first time in the discussions about MAID in Canada, this law has apparently caused a lot of Canadians to reconsider, because while all the earlier iterations of MAID have been supported by a majority of Canadians, a recent poll in September of 2023, just a few months ago, showed that the support for euthanasia for mental illness alone is less than 1/3 of Canadians. So here, for a majority of Canadians, they are against euthanasia for mental illness. Now, there was a bill that came up, C-314, that would have prevented euthanasia for mental illness alone. It did not pass, but it was very close, 167 to 150. So both within the wider votership and within the leadership of Parliament, the support for MAID for mental illness alone is much, much weaker, thank God, much weaker than it is for the other forms of MAID that have already come along. This past November, there was an editorial published in the Globe and Mail by Dr. K. Sonu Gained. He is the chief of psychiatry at Sunnybrook Hospital in Toronto. And he said, there is absolutely no consensus about what constitutes an irremediable medical condition when it comes to patients with mental illness. Now, that comment is important because the law requires that for a person to be approved for euthanasia, they must have an irremediable medical condition. And if you can't define it, you certainly cannot have it. While I am strongly opposed to any form of MAID or any instance of euthanasia, and I've shared this publicly many, many times, and not just me, but virtually all authorities in Jewish medical ethics and ethicists and moral teachers from throughout society, there is something uniquely chilling about MAID for mental illness. For example, an illness like depression. Because having MAID as the law, whatever you think of it, but having the law that allows for euthanasia does not raise the incidence of the disease. More people are not getting cancer, God forbid, because there is a way to be able to choose MAID to end one's life. One has no connection with the other. There is no increase to the amount of suffering that is going on among patients with terrible physical illnesses as a result of MAID. Just because there is such a thing as MAID doesn't mean that there is more suffering that is going on. It means there is an alternative to choose, if one were to choose that, but it's not increasing the suffering. But MAID for mental illness is different. I have the privilege and the burden to be in very close touch with a number of people who are suffering from depression and thoughts of suicide. And I learn a tremendous amount from them. I learn from them that there are days when they are okay. And there are days that are so bleak and so dark, the pain of living is too much to bear. But in general, for many of them, those days are followed by days that are okay, or at least not so bad. The key, of course, is to get through those dark days. And that's not easy. That's very, very hard. A person that does not have this condition, I don't think, can fully comprehend, appreciate how terribly difficult this is. But with the right support, with the right medical treatment, with the right psychological intervention, with the right people around, it is possible to have better days. And here's the point. Several people in this condition have told me that extending MAID to them who suffer from mental illness, they hear that as a message from the Canadian government. Just give in. The effort you're putting forth to survive is too great. It's too costly. Just choose MAID. And your life, they hear from this legislation, your life is just not worth that cost. So literally, MAID for mental illness can cause people who are not terminable, whose illness is not intractable, who can get better, to choose MAID because it's there. Hopefully, this is part of the reality that for the first time, the majority of Canadians oppose allowing this. Just a couple of weeks ago, on December 13th, 2023, Justice Minister Arif Virani said that the federal government may pause its original plan to permit MAID for mental illness so that it would not take effect in 2 months, this coming March. But right now is when this discussion is going on. Members of Parliament have the opportunity to oppose euthanasia for mental illness right now as they come back after the winter break this week. So right now, this week, today, I call on members of Parliament to reject euthanasia for mental illness. And I ask you to join me. Please urge your member of Parliament, your elected official, to not abandon people with mental illness to MAID. This is, at this moment, a winnable issue. Our voices right now can make a difference in the law in Canada. And especially when we can make a difference, we must try. Please, please, please advocate, along with me, for a stop on MAID for mental illness. Please make the statement to those who are suffering from the terrible illnesses of depression and other kinds of mental illnesses that your life is valuable, that your struggle is important, that we want to help you, that there can be better days, and we want to help see you get there. My friends, I wish you a great day, and I look forward to seeing you soon in person.